So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm Tzvia, the co-founder and CEO of Trajectory, and I'm honored to introduce Dr. Len today. You can see on my screen his rich curriculum, spent majority of his professional career as the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the American Cancer Society, a board certificate medical oncologist, and one of the more interesting, insightful individual I had a chance to meet with extremely interesting point of view of the world, COVID-19, and of course, as a cancer. So thank you, Dr. Len, for joining us this Friday afternoon. And would love for you to kick it off by telling us a little bit about your perspective as to what we're going on.
Sveta, thank you, and my thanks to you and to Trajectory for making this opportunity to talk to folks possible. As I mentioned to Sveta before we started, I've done radio and media in the past. Had my own radio show at one time, so I enjoy having the opportunity to reach out to folks, have conversations, and most importantly, if I watch the clock carefully enough, give enough time for people to engage and have a conversation around what's clearly become a very important topic. We're talking today about COVID, and the title was, Cancer Care and Research in the Age of COVID. But clearly over the past, not even 24 hours at this point, it was really early this morning when I first found out that the President and the First Lady had been diagnosed with COVID, and had the opportunity to put a blog up on that topic today. But coincidentally, also put a blog up yesterday about cancer screening in the age of COVID. So it's been quite a journey. It's been especially a difficult journey for folks with cancer or caring for those with cancer. And I think we all need to recognize that and try to put this in some degree of perspective. It's difficult to do that, to be sure, within a 15-minute conversation, but let's at least try to give some understanding. And as I mentioned, I certainly, and Svea and I both want to be able to leave time for questions and discussion and thoughts. I may not have all the answers. I don't pretend to be universally knowledgeable in everything, but with regard to COVID, I have had the experience with it, and hopefully we'll be able to put things in perspective. But we also have to remember that a whole lot more is known about COVID today than was back in February and March. I always like to start by putting things in perspective, because when it comes to cancer care, we have to remember where we were back in late February and early March. And that was really in a very difficult place. We didn't know, in fact, I put in my notes here, we knew nothing about COVID. We knew something about the fact it was a serious illness. We knew it was related to a family of viruses where, even though that the impact of those viruses in reality was small, that impact was felt around the world. The true impact was small, but the overarching impact was felt around the world. But we knew that these viruses had the potential to be lethal. And we knew that coming out of China, particularly for patients with cancer, the early reports were that patients with cancer were at great risk of serious illness, and unfortunately, even death from the COVID and from the coronavirus infection. The numbers were frightening, and in China, in the Chinese experience, it wasn't just the number of people who got COVID, it was also the fact that people in the hospital, and cancer patients are frequently in hospital, there were people in the hospital who went in uninfected, became infected in the hospitals, and unfortunately had very serious and fatal outcomes. So that's what we were faced with at that point in time. And as a result of that, as we know, a lot of parts of the country on the high level public health situation, a lot of parts of the country were shut down completely. And including organizations like the American Cancer Society. And my wife happens to be a physician at Emory here in Atlanta, and her clinic, she's a gynecologist, and her clinic and her surgeries were all canceled. Not slowed down. They were actually canceled except for urgent surgery and urgent care. So we were all in a very difficult position. And I will share with you that at that time, there were two aspects of greatest interest to me and the American Cancer Society. And that had to deal with the treatment patients would receive, and also screening. What would happen to screening? Well, we made the decision to recommend to people at average risk, and I think that's important. We made the recommendation to people at average risk of cancer that they consider not getting screening at that immediate period of time, and that was in March. And the reason for that was the benefit risk ratio. We knew that people could delay screening for a period of time, probably 2 or 3 months is what our thinking was then, without much impact, again, for people at average risk, not people at high risk of getting a colon cancer or breast cancer or any other cancer for that matter. But people who were at average risk would probably wait without much harm. That was one aspect. The other aspect was that we felt that people could have options for screening. That what was sort of baked into our psyches and our expectations didn't always necessarily have to be the case. So, for example, when it comes to mammography, women who are at average risk don't have breast cancer, and they're over the age of 50, or American Cancer Society guidelines over the age of 54, when they're in that group, and that screening every other year is an acceptable approach. So maybe this year someone did not have to have screening if they, again, keep saying that word, average risk. When it came to colon cancer, and perhaps people like myself get a colonoscopy I have to get one every 5 years because I've had a history of colon polyps, but every 5 years or every 10 years, maybe this year, if you were due for colonoscopy, that could wait and you could do a stool test at home instead of going to colonoscopy and then delay that for a year, unless your stool test turned up positive, and then you get in the door. And in fact, it wasn't only the American Cancer Society that made that recommendation. I was part of educational webinars, where the researcher at the Centers for Disease Control, who has an outstanding experience and knowledge of cancer care, she came straight out and said she would not recommend people get screening at that point in time. That comment was made in April. So the other part of the equation was cancer treatment. And what about cancer treatment? Well, there were some people who, there's no question, had to be treated immediately, and centers made accommodations for that. And in some situations, in certain breast cancer situations, for example, there were a number of organizations that actually came together and made alternative recommendations for how patients could be effectively treated. Maybe it wasn't going to be surgery immediately. Maybe it was going to be, in some situations, more commonly today, I should say, use chemotherapy treatments before, or targeted therapy treatments before surgery. Well, perhaps in other situations, such as DCIS, non-invasive breast cancer, perhaps hormonal treatment could be used before surgery, and that could be safely delayed. They actually would lay out different levels of risk for different people. So that was the situation at the beginning. And it wasn't only the medical profession that said, look, we have to pay attention and be prepared for the worst case scenario for patients. It was also patients and families themselves who said, right now it's not a place where I want to go. Well, the net result was, and the final point I should make in this, and there are many more points I could make, but one that's also important, oncologists around the country and cancer centers around the country stood up to the challenge, and they decided to go to more virtual visits. That is, the use of technologies like what we're using today, a little bit more sophisticated to protect privacy. They would go to virtual computer-based visits when possible, sometimes telephones, and try to do what they could online. And actually, that wasn't just true for cancer care, it was true for all sorts of care. And one of the interesting questions coming out of this experience is how much of that's how sticky is the word we would use, how sticky that practice is going to be. A lot of things have changed in our lives. We're doing more things online, we're doing Zoom conferences, we're ordering online, we're getting takeout meals delivered to our house. All those things are happening. And the question for all of these aspects is how much of that is going to continue over time. So we were in the situation, we thought that with behaviors, and we had data to show us that with, quote, good behavior, there were periods that we were looking forward. In fact, here in Georgia, where I paid a lot of attention, still pay attention to what's going on. Here in Georgia, we had a date that was predicted in the middle of June, when the number of COVID cases would have been down to a very, very low level, to a point where they would predict in many states a date that containment, that having to stay at home and not go out, when that date would come, and we could pretty much, if we followed precautions, go back to almost, if not a completely normal lifestyle, a much more normal lifestyle than even what we're experiencing today. Unfortunately, that date never got here. It didn't get here for a lot of reasons that I'm not going to get into, but that remains one of the, for me, important questions of this entire pandemic. We were so close. It was not easy to be isolated, but the reality was we saw a way out. We didn't get there, and we're not there now. And the net result, as we all know, is we've seen COVID somewhat come and go, although in reality what's happened is we've had the first wave, and it's not a wave, the first increase in cases, then it tailed off a little bit. Then we had a second increase in cases, and it tailed off a little bit, but at a higher level. And now we're headed, it appears, into that third level. So it's almost a step-like increase in the number of cases. And yet our lives have to go on. And when it comes to cancer, a lot of adaptations have gone on. A lot of adaptations have gone on in medical care generally. And again, if you're interested, I wrote a piece in my blog last week. It's at drlen.blog, where I talked about a hospital in New England, not Farber, but Brigham and Women's, of which Farber is a part of, but Brigham and Women's, who had no cases at the time they published that article, or one case that they thought was due to in-hospital transfer. So medical facilities paid attention. And one of the major questions right now is to make sure, major issues, is how we have patients and families understand that safety is in a better place now than it was before. We know more. We know much more now. We don't know everything. There's a lot we don't know. But we do know that if we do what we need to do, we can keep people safe in a medical environment. And that's critically important. But having said that, interestingly and unfortunately, this past week, I think it was the day before yesterday, there was an article in the New York Times which talked about that same hospital, which now has a cluster outbreak in the hospital itself. So risk still exists, but nowhere near the level it has been before. And as I wrote in my blog yesterday, I think that people need to really start thinking about getting back to cancer screening, because the delays now are substantial, and they are going to impact the opportunity to catch a cancer earlier. It may impact survival. It may alter the treatment if it's caught later as opposed to earlier. And many oncologists and many experts are concerned. The director of the National Cancer Institute, Dr. Ned Sharpless, recently wrote an article that appeared in Science magazine. And that article looked at some numbers, what we call modeling, that is trying to take information we have and try to predict what the future will be. Far from a perfect science. Depends on a lot of inputs and things that you put into a model. So it's not perfect, but it gives you an idea. And Dr. Sharpless has said based on that model, they would anticipate an increase of 10,000 deaths over the next 10 years as a result of this delay and the issues that did come up with treatment. I personally and many others feel that those numbers may be even larger. And those will be lives that would be lost that if we applied and did what we already know works, if we had that opportunity, if we didn't have COVID, that people would go see the doctor, if they would get the care that they need, that we would be able to we would be able to impact that number. But right now with the delays and now with the fall surge coming up, we are very, very concerned. And that takes me to another point that I want to underline and emphasize. And this is general for everybody. If you can get a flu shot, get it, and get it early, because in some countries like Australia, they actually found a decline in flu because people followed COVID restrictions. Here in this country, some people practice COVID restrictions, some people don't, and I suspect the flu will be less of an issue this year than it has been in the past. but it will still be an issue. And the problem is going to be if you get sick, what do I have? And can I get tested? Can I get a flu test? Well, the flu tests are in short supply because everybody shifted to the COVID test. Will I be able to get a COVID test? And the answer to that is we hope, but we're not certain. It appears that the situation is improving. But even there, the type of tests that are being offered are not 100% accurate. And they have some what we call false negatives. You can have COVID and not show up on the test. So at least as a preventive measure, getting a flu shot, and for patients with cancer, it's important, and talk to your clinician, make sure that you can get the flu shot. Some people cannot because the different types of viruses that are used may be a problem. But for most patients with cancer, and especially for the people around them, whether it's friends, colleagues, family, they who are otherwise well and don't take any other medications that might compromise their immune system, they should get a flu shot because creating that little community of safety is so critically important. Let's take a brief moment to talk about research, because research has also been significantly impacted. I will tell you that I've had a long career in oncology, and I've had the opportunity to watch research progress. Early on, years ago, I was very concerned about the overpromises and under-delivery of what was happening. But now I can look back and I can say what really was going on was that we were creating a fundamental base upon which to improve the care of patients with cancer. And I can also tell you that the care of patients with cancer are opportunities to do something meaningful, truly meaningful for patients with cancer are much better today than they were even 10 years ago. That doesn't mean we're as successful as we want to be. We're not as successful as we need to be. But we have diseases like melanoma and more recently lung cancer, for example, that basically were refractory to treatment in the advanced stage. We could do something, but we couldn't do much. And today, we now have responses that are not only effective, but they're durable. And they go on for years. And some lung cancer patients with targeted therapies have had substantial long-term responses. Patients with melanoma with immunotherapy have had long-term responses. And so we need to be aware of that fact. So research has had results. And in fact, there's so many new drugs coming out for cancer that I don't know any oncologist who can keep track of all of it. That's why we have so many people going to oncology specialties and diseases where you used to have a general oncologist trained like myself. Today, they're highly specialized. But that's a good thing because we have more things we can do. We have more opportunities of what we can do. However, the research enterprise has been impacted substantially. Both the clinical research enterprise, that is the clinical trials piece, which I know Trajectory is so interested in, they shut down a lot of clinical trials. I don't know if they shut down all clinical trials, but a whole lot got shut down, particularly those who required new drugs. And now the researchers and the pharmaceutical companies have come together and they've done workarounds to try to make sure people can get drugs. People can't travel. People go to clinical trials at a cancer center, they may travel hundreds of miles to go to that cancer center to get that medicine. How do you give the medicine locally? And in some cases, that's happened. What about lab tests? Lab tests that should be done, that the researchers want done, or x-rays, radiology studies that they want done at the main center. Now they're being done in local institutions. Questions about the quality, questions about whether the accuracy is the same. Having said that, the pharmaceutical companies, the researchers, and the FDA are working together to resolve those issues. So we're making progress, but the basic research enterprise and the clinical research enterprise has been damaged. There were labs that were completely shut down. Some still are shut down. Experiments were lost. And in the meantime, as these labs open up, they're like doctors' offices. They're not opening up at full capacity. So as we consider all of these things, and given the time here, I want to be able to open up for questions and comments. Given all those considerations, where are we today? Well, we're in a much better place today than we were 7 months ago, but we're not in a perfect place. And we face uncertainty. And one of the lessons that's been writ large and we're all well aware of with this pandemic. You think you know what's going on, but you don't know what's going on. And even the President of the United States, putting all the politics and all the other issues aside, the President of the United States and his wife are infected. And if there's a lesson that comes out of that, it suggests that even with putting a circle around an individual where people who come in contact, and I don't know all of the information about the testing programs, but people who come close contact with the president are tested very regularly, daily, I believe, and perhaps more often than that. And even with all that testing, the president got infected. Now, we can talk about what he may or may not have done, what he may or may not have said, what he may or may not have practiced. This is the president of the United States, and he has coronavirus. And I did post a blog this morning, if you're interested, again, at drlen.blog. If you're interested, it's there, talking about where I think the issues are going to be over the next several weeks. And they could be, unfortunately, extremely serious, and they may not be. And we don't know, and no one knows, at least none of us will know at this point in time today as we're speaking, what the situation is going to be. But it could be extremely serious, or it may not. Having said that, we all need to be aware that this is a dangerous virus, but we also need to be aware that we have to learn to live with it. If you're a patient with cancer, and especially if you're a patient currently undergoing active treatment, be careful. And those around you have to be careful. One of the most difficult things that we've experienced in our household is the fact that we have grandchildren, and we have not seen our grandchildren, nor will we see our grandchildren in the flesh, so to speak, in a live situation, because of the risk they present. And unfortunately, my wife and myself, because of age and perhaps other factors, are vulnerable. Many of the people with cancer being older and having cancer and other medical conditions are vulnerable. So it's really important to be as careful as you possibly can be. But that doesn't mean you can't live life in those ways that are safe. And so it may mean going out to a restaurant and eating outside and wearing a mask and avoiding the distance and making sure the servers are attentive. You can pretty well look at a place, even the doctor's office, you can look at a place and tell if they're taking precautions or not. Hand sanitizers, distance, number of people in the waiting room, making sure the chairs are far enough apart. I personally like to see, you may have seen this in the grocery store, I like to see plexiglass between the person who's taking my information and myself. But I did go to a hospital where they didn't have that plexiglass. I wasn't worried about me. I was more worried about the young lady who had to do that all day long, talking to all sorts of people. But you can get a pretty good idea of what is safe and what you need to do. Even when you go to the grocery store, go to a department store, a big box store, Walmart, for example. I went to one in a certain part of Georgia. We have a home in North Georgia. Went there and we walked out because we didn't feel safe. We went back and we felt a lot more safe. That Walmart had made an effort to try to improve the situation. It wasn't perfect, but it was a heck of a lot better than it was before. So we need to live our lives. Cancer screening is part of that discussion. The research programs will come back. The federal government the National Cancer Institute is making some effort to help support young researchers, which are the lifeblood of the future of cancer research. And we need organizations like the American Cancer Society who fund innovative research. They desperately need to get their funding. They've had to suspend their grants for young investigators because they do not have the funding to pay the grants, even those that they promised they were going to pay for. And if we use our common sense, if we take precautions, we can get through this. A vaccine will be coming. It will not be coming tomorrow, whether it comes before the election. But I do know one thing. I don't care when it comes, because when it comes, we still have a long way to go. It will not be here today, and the virus will not be here today and gone tomorrow. That's not going to happen. It's going to be with us for quite some time. And so consequently, if we want to get back to life, if we want to live our life live our lives with our friends, our family, our coworkers, then we need to do what we need to do. And patients with cancer need to be especially careful. So Svea, with that, wanted to do about 15 minutes. I went a little bit over, but I hope it was helpful. And I certainly would be glad to answer any questions. And as I mentioned, I've sort of been on top of this issue about screening and the president in the within the last 24 hours. So this webinar is very timely from that perspective.
So thank you so much for your inputs, and I think it was very valuable and interesting. And I told you to go as much as you want because I knew it will be of great value to everyone who's joined us to this Zoom. And guys, feel free to ask any question, or you can unmute yourself, or also to chat your question, and I'll share it with Dr. Lin. I want to start by one. You talked briefly about the research and clinical trials, which we care greatly about, because like you said, no one oncologist can be familiar with all treatment option, and we find those to be extremely valuable and important for patients to have access and oncologists to have a discussion about. Do you feel that there were talks even before COVID about the needs to adjust a little bit, to do just in time, to bring them more into the community setting, instead of just putting them inside and basically expecting patient to find them, actually find out where the patients are and what their profile is like, and making an alignment towards the patient? And if anything comes out of COVID, I would like to see that it's happening. What are your thoughts about it? Would that expedite that if that's what you feel like needs to happen?
So that's a conversation. You know, you told me I could talk as long as I want. So if we have an afternoon and tomorrow, maybe we can continue the chat. I don't want to hold people for a long time. But that's an important topic because the issue of clinical trials has been a serious problem for years. It's not new. And it's a serious problem because we cannot get enough patients, enough people into clinical trials. And that's for a lot of different reasons. There may be a natural hesitancy. In some communities, particularly in the Black community, there's unfortunately a long history of abuse when it comes to the concept of clinical trials. So that, you know, the Black folks are generally significantly underrepresented in clinical trials. Getting the trial to the patient where they are. I have a phrase I've used for quite some time. I call finding the person where they are. So in this age of genomic medicine, when we have these opportunities to what we call targeted therapies, that is treatments that are focused on particularly genetic abnormality, and we can find that abnormality by doing a lab test. We can test the tissue, and now we can do blood tests that have been approved to do the same thing. We could accelerate our discovery and our knowledge if we had access. So that has been a real issue for a long time. There have been, by the way, some trial programs set up that do have a wide reach around the country. They're not just at high-level National Cancer Institute cancer centers. One program that I'm familiar with is called LungMAP. And LungMAP is run through the National Cancer Institute, but it has had 700 and some sites around the country. I used to live in South Georgia, in a town, Thomasville, Georgia, north of Tallahassee. And imagine my surprise when I saw that a LungMAP site was up the road in Valdosta, Georgia. That didn't normally happen before. So we need to find the patients with those genetic abnormalities, because in some of them, they're very, very few and very rare. So we need that technology available, which it is in communities. We need to be able to say that this might be something that could be part of a clinical trial, having a system that makes that happen. And then you have the situation as, well, that's really great. Somebody comes in and says, I live in Thomasville, Georgia. You say, well, yeah, but for this, you have to go to Atlanta. You say, well, I don't want to go to Atlanta, maybe one. I don't have the money to go to Atlanta. I've got a job, I've got to work. And if I take a day off, I may lose my job. So trying to get those trials closer to home is critically important. And yes, that is something, a lot of things have accelerated as a result of COVID. Zoom calls have accelerated as a result of COVID. That has a good side and a bad side, because all these Zoom calls at 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night for meetings or whatever, it's expanded our days. But at least I don't have to get on an airplane. a lot of things have accelerated. Hopefully, the changes in clinical trials, the workarounds that were made by necessity will hopefully come to be routine. Remember, in the beginning of COVID, clinical trials were shut down, and some were not even started.
Yeah.
And everybody, and that's huge. I am not. I got to tell you, as I mentioned earlier, if you were on the call and you heard me say it, I had a lot of concern about what I call the hope and the hype about cancer care, the overpromising and under-delivering. It went on for an awfully long time. And I will tell you from my heart that I think we're in an era, and again, let me emphasize, it's not enough. It is not enough. But we are in an era where we have so much more and so much more opportunity. And clinical trials are a critical part of making that progress work. And so, yes, it's important. I will tell you that the American Cancer Society has brought a coalition together that actually has been effective in trying to address some of these issues. We've had a lot of coalitions in the past, and they haven't been as effective as we would like. But even to the point of trying to get standard language in a medical record so you can search a medical record and see if a person's acceptable, it has the right qualification characteristics, I should say, for a clinical trial. Even that is now finally, after decades, coming to fruition. So progress, but we need to do more. And then on top of that, we need to make sure people can get access to trials, because without patients and families and commitment, we will not make progress. And now we have so much more opportunity than we've ever had before.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
My name is Dr. Kaplan. I'm a medical doctor, and I have a story to share, and then I'll ask the question afterwards. I, by happenstance, ran into the study of Drs. Campbell and Esselstyn about no animal products, whole non-processed foods. I had a patient of mine 24 years ago. From day one, she had a stage 4 breast cancer, positive estrogen positive receptors. She underwent all the standard care. She literally had a radical mastectomy. She, after about 3 years of this chemo, radio, and mastectomy, she ran out of any other hope. There was nothing that they can give her. So she was very upset. And so I said to her, let's just try giving you a whole plant, non-processed foods. She lived 23 years with a stage 4 cancer. She had a little bit of metastasis in her pleura. And it's a very constraining diet. She wanted to go last September to Europe. And I said, no, I'm not going to let you. The planes have a lot of viruses and bacteria. That was, before COVID. It was around September, October. And I said, I'm not going to let you go. You're going to be 20 hours in the plane, because she was coming from California. And then you're going to be in the cruiser, and the cruisers have also those deadly ducts full of bacteria. And they're not going to give you the right food. It's going to be all processed. It's not going to be what you need. And then you're going to go for another week to just regular restaurants in Europe. I said, no, it's incompatible with the healthy life you had. She was absolutely in great shape, so much that she wanted to tramp around the world. She was always in great shape. So she finally blew her top. She said to me, well, I'm sorry, I cannot live a lifestyle that I cannot just tramp around Europe. So she said, I don't want to hear from you. She hung up on me. So I heard later what happened. Because she obviously did not eat much during the trip, she was very, very slender. And so when she went for a checkup every couple months to her oncologist, the oncologist was alarmed of her loss of weight. And so she immediately put her on Sustacal and Sure, all sorts of, protein powders and things to stimulate her weight loss. And so what that did, and I am sharing this with the audience because it's an incredibly important subject. She immediately started having her pleural cancer invade to the point that it was 100% obscuring the entire lung. She had zero perfusion in her lung. And then it metastasized to the opposite lung. She ended up having about 40% perfusion in that lung. And right away went to the bone, which she never had metastasis. And college was very, very upset about this. So she felt that she has to give her full range chemotherapy. And I know all about this because I became very on with the family, and everybody, told me about it, what was going on, but she didn't want to talk to me. And so basically, in 7 months from the day that she went to Europe, to all these miraculous chemotherapy and Sustacalin and all these supplements, she died. So this is a story for me to share with you because you're in the clinical trials. But my question to you is, if she would have been alive, because I was really asking, and I had this emails with Zivia Bader and begged her, and I said, please, who can do something with clinical trials for a positive breast, estrogen positive receptors? What are the trials and what's the status of that? Thank you.
Well, I think there are two parts to your comment and your question. And first off, I'll be generic here, just so you know. I hear stories like this regularly, and patient events, and it's not just with breast cancer, it's not just with chemotherapy, it might be another disease and another treatment. And in fact, I'm in some discussions right now with someone who has a series of alternative treatments that they believe work, or repurposed drugs that may have had a benefit in one disease and one it should, and they, for a variety of reasons, sometimes substantive reasons. So I've been around quite some time. And I don't know if you're aware or not, but the National Cancer Institute, I know it was NCI or the NIH, put an office in place a number of years ago to actually look at alternative treatments for cancer, and that grew out of a lot of interest in something called Leonard. We don't hear much about that today, but they grew out of that, and they do, at least in my last contact, I haven't looked at it recently, they tried to examine treatments and verify information and try to say what happens, and if there are clues about what happens, then taking another step further. We've heard, and it's not just in the matter of treatment for cancer, what happens to any one individual. It also relates to other things that are much more common, such as vitamins, preventing cancer. We've been through a number of series of vitamin claims have been made and have not been able to be substantiated. And I've learned a long time ago. And for example, there was one situation that was very, very prominent a number of years ago, and I wrote about it, and others have talked about it. DCA, dichloroacetic acid, where the claim was that it was very effective in treating cancer. It was a chemical that was used for actually dry cleaning, but also and it does have a clinical use in children with chronic lactic acidosis. So and recently I've heard a lot about CBD oil and the miraculous cures of CBD oil. I'm just saying, I hear these stories. When I started my practice, there were a number of people in my community, and that was a long time ago when we did not have effective chemotherapy, who went on a very strict metabolically controlled diet regimen. That back then we sort of said, okay, if you want to, that's your business. Subsequently became something very similar to, I think it was called the Pritikin diet, where everything was taken out of the diet, people were doing well. So how do you do a clinical trial around that, and how you actually prove the claims? I think one of the problems, I think we ought to be very careful. I'm not saying about this case, and I accept what you're saying. You had the experience and the direct knowledge of this person. But I think we have to be very careful to understand that it's a process. How one gets people interested in doing that process and taking a look at it is another question. It's not something that's easily done. I will say, by the way, for the benefit of the audience, that a plant-based, with the American Cancer Society, for example, strongly recommends people move to as much of plant-based diets as they can and avoid processed meats and avoid red meat. So that has been shown to have a cancer reducing the incidence of cancer. So there's some value in that. I think when it comes to actually getting into a clinical trial, it's not just something of this type. It's also other ideas, and frankly, other drugs, other medicines that may have shown some opportunity in the laboratory. And how do you get them to the clinical trial? And let me share with you that even medicines that follow a more traditional path, there are thousands of them out there. And getting the funding and getting a process in place, and then getting them into, to see if they're successful, and then getting somebody to invest all of the money that has to be invested is incredibly difficult. So whether it may be what we would call alternative complementary therapies, whether it may be treatments that are in fact that are come out of a laboratory and have a laboratory basis to be successful, there are a lot of those situations out there that can't get into trials. And that's one of the reasons that expanding clinical trials would be is so necessary. We don't do a good job of getting patients and families involved, channeling our resources, and making it possible from a financial standpoint to get things done. If a drug is generic, for example, nobody's going to touch it. That was the situation with DCA. They had the lab look very interesting. There was a scientific basis for why it might work. They had some patients who were treated, and they had some responses, but they couldn't get any interest from the people who held the pocketbook because there was no money. And I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just saying that is the reality. So I don't have a simple answer for a very.
We're very impressed. We are very impressed with the Nobel Prize winner work of Dr. Allison from MD Anderson on the clinical trials on melanoma. And now he's able to cure it with immunotherapy. Is there any progress in breast cancer with immunotherapy?
Well, I'm going to respond, but then others may want to ask a question as well. But Dr. Allison did the basic work on immunotherapy. And let me just share with you, I was an immunotherapy researcher back in 1972. Dr. Allison did his work in the 1980s, I believe. Immunotherapy came into being in the late 90s, and the research was reported in 2009 or 2010 of being effective in melanoma. And at ASCO last year, I got up and I made a comment, and I've wrote about it in my blog, which is on cancer.org. We missed the fact in plain sight what had happened in advanced melanoma. That's a long journey. There have been responses in immunotherapy in breast cancer, particularly in triple negative. But it's not as robust as we have seen in other diseases, particularly those the more typical estrogen receptor positive disease. So immunotherapy keeps progressing, the treatments keep progressing, but we have to get the trials in place to really know what the value is. And see, you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah, before I move on, just to Gabriela, we were going to schedule a Zoom in the coming weeks with Vital, that is a cancer researcher and part of the trajectory team, and we're going to dive into immunotherapy in breast cancer and lung cancer and talk about some of the advancement and the combination there. So I think you will be able to get more answer to your question.
Can I add to that, Svea? Lung cancer melanoma has been remarkable. Again, not enough, but we have long-term high-quality survivors in patients with melanoma with advanced disease we didn't have before. And I would also point out in lung cancer, we have had, the data started to show up over a year ago, and now it's been confirmed. We've had a significant reduction in mortality from lung cancer as a result of immunotherapy. In lung cancer, the sad reality is that biases and stigma within the system, among the community and among the medical profession, and the inability to get people in the door and cared for is a major problem. And we could reduce deaths from lung cancer substantially, or at least improve the quality of life for people if we did what we already know. And it's a whole other topic, but we can do an awful lot better than we are right now. And because we do have drugs that work.
Agreed. So we have a question in the chat that I'd like to share, relating a little bit to the clinical trial. How safe do you think the vaccine will be given the rush through the process? And should cancer survivor be concerned about taking the vaccine?
That's a great question. And it's a great question to which neither I nor anyone else has the real answer. I will say this. So let's understand the process. and I have a context. I'm going to state the context first. When I was a resident at Hopkins, it was during what was called the swine flu. And I don't know if any of you have read the story in the New York Times and reported it recently, but it was a lesson, and I lived through it. And there was an outbreak of what was called swine flu. It was thought to be highly lethal. It started at an Army base in New Jersey. The vaccine was rushed into production. We all lined up, including me. I still remember being at the hospital getting my shot, thinking we were going to be saving lots of lives. It turned out that there wasn't much swine flu that got out of that Army base. Unfortunately, the deaths were very limited, and a lot of people got vaccinated. That's not why the flu didn't spread. Just the flu really didn't take off the way they thought. What did happen, however, was that there were a number of cases of what we call Guillain-Barré syndrome. People got a paralytic syndrome, what we call ascending paralysis. It was, for most people, transitory. But boy, it was really prominent in the news, and it was of great concern to a lot of us. So that's a lesson learned that actually happened. It is critically important. So what do I believe? I believe that the vaccine manufacturers are trying to do the best they can to produce vaccines and put them through clinical trials to determine at a very preliminary level about their safety. And we've already had a safety signal from one situation that we're all probably well familiar with. However, to prove safety, it's much different to prove safety in a relatively small trial than giving it to millions and millions of people. And there is always risk with any medicine. This is well known with any medicine, such as cancer medicines, that when they go out into the community, what's called phase 4, we always see side effects that we never anticipated. So it's critically important with this vaccine that it be tested carefully. And it's even more important because a number of the technologies that are being used to produce vaccines today to induce an immune response are different technologies than what we have used traditionally. So my expectation is we're going to see a number of candidates come forward. They will be tested. They will be considered, some will be considered safe and effective. They may be effective in some populations and less so in others. So for example, the flu vaccine is less effective in older people like me. And that's why they get a stronger dose of the vaccine than younger people do, but it's still not perfect. It never has been perfect. But the vaccine does help reduce the risk of transmission within communities. So we will get to that point. And then we will probably have follow-on vaccines that are currently beginning development and study that will probably be more effective. So we are on a journey. And I think, and I will say this, and I don't try to avoid political statements, it is critically important that the manufacturers, the data safety monitoring boards, the FDA, and there's a group called ACIP that dictates how vaccines should be used, that all of those should not be pressured politically. I promise you, they understand the issue full well about what needs to be done. We need a vaccine that will help us. But come back to what I said in the course of my conversation. We will have a vaccine, but it will not be perfect. The virus will not go away. It will take a period of time to understand how the vaccine works. It will take a period of time for the vaccine to get into the community. We have a long way to go. So the precautions are going to be valid. As to what it means for patients with cancer, that's a subgroup, and patients with any serious disease, liver disease, for example, who have abnormal immune systems, that's going to be a population that has to be studied because these are not going to be live vaccines, but the competence and capacity of someone who's receiving cancer treatment to develop a response to a vaccine remains to be determined. At this point, what we have are healthy volunteers who have been participating in very early stage trials, now moving into larger trials. They're looking for people of different communities, different ethnicities, and different situations to try to make those trials comprehensive. We still have a lot to learn. And will I take it when it comes right out of the box? I'll let you know. Um, I'm not going to say anything here because I think those are conversations that if you have concerns need to be discussed with someone who is knowledgeable about the vaccines. I'm sure we will have plenty of information coming to us through various media channels to help address those issues.
Thank you for that. We have a time for one last question. We have 5 minutes. If no question asked, then I want to ask a question. Then we talked about the clinical trials before, and I think it's also true to the treatment. So since this is not going away, and this is here for the long term, and since you're talking about the next step coming in, not a wave, but a step, do you foresee changes in terms of, are we not going to see in the next step trial being suspended in a clearly way, treatment, surgeries being stopped the way we've seen at the beginning? What do you anticipate?
Yeah, so great question, not an easy answer. So let me try to tackle it from several levels. First of all, let me share that when this virus started, we actually got phone calls from a number of people where their treatment was literally stopped.
So did we, majority of our patients.
Yeah, so the clinical trials were stopped. I'm talking about routine treatments. There was somebody I won't mention where they were from, that called us right at the very beginning and said they were getting radiation therapy for the pancreatic cancer, and the doctor stopped it because they made a decision not to continue the treatment. Whether there were more reasons to it than that, I'm sure. Another call that I participated in was with somebody who had breast cancer, and we had talked about their cancer, their treatment, and moving forward. This was during a week. And then they called me late on a Friday evening that their surgery was going to be a problem on Monday, which I was surprised they were going to be able to get surgery on Monday because most hospitals were diverting surgeries at that point. But they were supposed to get their surgery on Monday. One of the surgeons got COVID. This is very early on. And so their surgery, and this was a specialty surgeon, so they had to try to find somebody else to come in. It was difficult to do that. So that's a background. That's what was happening. You all probably have your own stories and people you know. Will we go into another? So let's assume a worst case scenario. Let's assume that the virus and the flu both take off, creates a national crisis, and the question then becomes, as it has been all the way through this, will we shut down our community, not the whole nation? Will we shut down our community? We already have indicators of when communities should be shut down. Harvard School of Public Health published had a map that said if the incidence of cases with 25 per 100,000 new cases per day was over 25 per 100,000, you need to shut your community down because there's community transmission. Nobody did it. Nobody did it. Do I think it's going to happen again? Maybe it should happen, but I think it's unlikely to happen. Will hospitals shut down? It depends on the demands of that hospital and that community. So you hear the stories in Wisconsin of hospitals that are now completely overburdened. That means a lot of resources have to go to COVID. Those hospitals are not going to be able to do elective surgeries. They'll do urgent care, but I think they're going to be a lot more reluctant to shut down absent a pressing situation. Do I think that that's the best thing? It's far beyond me at this point to determine the human psyche. Here's the reality, what I firmly believe. If we had done, and if we do, what we know works, the masks, the hand washing, the social distancing, and unfortunately, as data has shown us, even small family gatherings, and we've had to cancel, it's personal, we had to cancel ours in our family for a major birthday. And we said, no, we're not going to do it. If we did what we know, we would substantially reduce the spread of this disease, we would open our economy, and we would all be better for it. That's what I firmly believe. Do we have the fortitude to do that? Unfortunately, so some do, but many don't. Too many don't. And in some parts of this country, like in rural Georgia, they paid a huge price. In the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't know any different. And it's so sad to see what happened in some of the smaller communities where I used to live. Today, we know different, and we're still seeing the same things happen, not to quite the same degree. So if we want to keep on going, if we want to get cancer care, if we want to get cancer screening, if we want to get in to see our doctors and get our blood tests and get our blood pressures checked, we need to do what we know works. And we could make a difference. And that's the sad reality of this entire situation.